This occurred when I was 18 and backpacking my way through the world. I always looked a few years younger than my actual age and often had problems getting into places. I often find myself hissing, "No, I'm really an adult," to the people who refuse to believe my ID card. I arrived in Western Australia in January in a little town that looked nothing like the brightly coloured postcard world that I left behind in Sydney. I rented a car and was getting used to the Aussie way of driving and didn't pay attention to the fact that I'm running out of fuel. So naturally, now the car suddenly gives up. I wasn't worried though. I had a spare tank in the trunk. I had problems getting the lid off though. No matter how hard I pulled it, it didn't give in. So I started walking back to the little cluster of shops I spotted earlier. I was greeted by a man on an ATV-ish thing, sitting outside a shop. He nodded in the direction of the road and said, "Problem with the car, missy?" I must have looked puzzled because he smiled and said, "No one comes walking in here from that direction. There's nothing out there." I explained the situation and he listened sympathetically. "Do you rent the car from the Free Freddy? No wonder he gave you it. You can't trust that bloke, you see." He introduced himself as Charlie and quickly got off and offered me a spare tank, saying, "You want to ride back? It's an awfully warm day. No ozone layer here, you see." He was speaking weirdly. I felt a bit stupid hesitating, but he seems like a nice guy. And he was right. The sun was terrible. My shoulders are already burnt despite sun cream. He must have sensed my hesitation because he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "I'm not the boogeyman. I promise you. I just don't want anyone out here in this weather. I would have offered you a ride if you're a 40-year-old bloke too. Here, take my helmet. My head ain't worth protecting anyway." And so I get on the back of his ATV, the spare petrol tank in front of me, and get a somewhat uneasy feeling in my stomach. "Just tap my shoulder if you want me to slow down, alright?" He drove the short distance to my car, but he didn't slow down. I tapped his shoulder again and again. He drove past it. In the rearview mirror, I could see him grin as he speeded up. I can't jump. The speed was so high it would have killed me, and I had no idea where he was taking me, but I knew his intentions were evil. This continued for 30 minutes, until I could see a rest stop, clearly made for people to stop and enjoy the view. As we approached the rest stop, I see my chance and grab hold of his throat with both hands, squeezing as hard as I can. I felt him struggle to keep the vehicle on the road, while fighting for air. As we come up alongside the rest stop, he had no choice but to stop. I threw myself off, tossing the helmet and screaming loudly enough to wake the dead. There was a truck there, but no one in view. However, only a moment later, the door to the loo opened, and this terrifying looking man with a beard pops out and demanded to know what the hell was happening. I pointed to my abductor and cried that he tried to kidnap me, and the grisly man tried to grab a hold of the abductor but wasn't fast enough. Soon, he was gone. The grisly man turned out to be really nice and phones the police for me, waiting with me until the police arrive. Since that day, I don't judge by appearance. Charlie was a nice looking person and seemed to have good intentions. George looked like he had been awakened from his ancient lair, but was a really good guy. I later made my way back home, and this is by far the creepiest thing that ever happened to me. Back in 2000 or 2001, I was driving by myself from visiting my mum in Colorado back to Arizona. I was in a station wagon and had a desk my mum had given me that was my grandfather's. I've always been scared driving at night, and I'm always worried there's someone in my back seat that's gonna get me. This might be because I've watched far too many scary movies, or because my mum's paranoia rubbed off to me. I was in the army and drove back and forth a lot to visit her. She would get mad at me for sleeping at rest stops or gas stations, telling me someone's gonna kidnap or kill me. But I just didn't want to be bothered with the hassle and expense of a motel most of the time. So I'm driving on an empty section of highway late at night with no other cars around. This red truck comes up behind me, flashing me with his lights and honking his horn at me. I was thinking to myself that there was something wrong with my car. Maybe there was something wrong with the desk in the hatchback. Because why else would somebody be so insistent on me pulling over? So I pull over and get out of my car. As I'm getting out of my car, he's directly behind me, still flashing his lights and honking his horn. I go to about the middle of the car. I planned on going to the back to see what could have been wrong with my car when it hit me. Why is he still honking at me when I'm getting out? That's odd. Then he gets out of his truck. That's when I knew something just wasn't right. I jumped back in my car and sped off. The nearest exit's 50 miles away or so. He follows me the entire time. I take the first exit and go to a crowded grocery store with a laundromat next to it. There was an ambulance parked at the laundromat with its lights flashing, and I'm next to it. I figured there was an ambulance, so there must be police officers there. Now the man stayed in his truck in the grocery store parking lot watching me the entire time. I was terrified. I didn't want to get out of my car and felt like an idiot if I would have had to tell someone what happened. I waited an hour, and finally he left. After he left, I waited a little longer before continuing my drive back to Arizona. I was paranoid and watched for any red trucks the entire time. Fast forward about 5 or 6 years, I was watching a crime show on TV, and what story pops up? One about a man on that exact stretch of highway with the same red truck, using them tactics to get a woman to stop before murdering her and others. I'm so glad that my gut told me something was wrong, and I got back in my car and kept on driving. This happened to my wife while we were dating. When we were dating, I lived in southern New Hampshire and she lived in Philadelphia. Most of the time, I would come down and visit her. Since she works at college, she had a few weeks off in December. She decided to come up and stay with me. She's packed a week's worth of clothes and her cat in the car and drove up after work. Driving on an interstate at night means coffee, which means bathroom breaks. She pulls into a rest stop in Connecticut. By rest stop, I mean bathroom, vending machine, and a rack of tourist brochures. As she's walking towards a building, a man, wearing jeans, an army jacket and knife cap walks out between 2 cars starting on her. The man immediately reaches out, grabs her head with both hands. He's standing in front of her, arms out straight. She's not able to pull his hands off her head. He's staring into her eyes with a detached expression. As she described it, I think it's the same expression I use when I'm trying to debug or figure out why something isn't working. He's moving her head back and forth, keeping her off balance, keeping her at arm's length. She stares back. He seems to evaluate her for a minute or two, then lets go and quickly walks into a wooded section. She runs into the rest stop, finds an attendant. She uses the bathroom, then tells the attendant is willing to walk her out to her car to make sure she leaves safely. She walks out with the attendant and notices that a white van that was previously there is gone. She gets in the car, thanks the attendant, and drives off. About 10 minutes later, she's processed what happened and calls me. Then, the bit about the van worried her, but terrifies me. We talk for a little bit. She's familiar with the law enforcement and offenders and have a brief that this wasn't just a foul mugging. She talks to the police, but they didn't seem to be too interested. What worried her the most was that her cat would have suffered in the cold if something happened to her. After that, every time I drove between NH and PA, I've stopped at the rest stop for a few minutes to try and look for white vans. I don't know what I could have done, maybe got a reg plate at least, but I've never seen them. It's terrifying thinking there's people out there like this. I'm just glad nothing ever happened then. First, I'm gonna say I'm a 16-year-old male with paranoia. I always carry a knife with me and get scared easily. I'm 175 pounds, 5'7" and a power lifter. I was crossing Alabama into Mississippi when I had to use a bathroom. My grandfather was driving me back to my dad's house in Jackson, MS. He pulled into a rest stop area and stretched his legs when I got to the bathroom. There was no security at the rest area and bathroom is in the back of the building. The only person in there with me was at a urinal. I walked to the stall farthest from the door. As I walked by him, he turned around and started walking at me. His pants weren't unzipped at the urinal. He reaches for something in his pocket and I hear a flick. That's when I realised that something's in his hand, and I forgot my knife. I then see the bathroom door open and someone came in. The guy's coming towards me, put in his pocket in his hands, and left. This happened 2 weeks ago. The guy was white, bald in late 30s, maybe 40s. He had a black shirt with green cargo shorts, and I haven't really told many people about this. I'm very grateful that the stranger came in when he did. God knows what would have happened to me if he didn't. This was a story I grew up hearing my mum telling me about. I was really young when this happened, and I know for a fact it was before I was 5. I only have some foggy memory of the event, especially because my mum at the time didn't want to freak me out. Now, for some context, first, we have a family all over the country. I remember spending so much of my childhood just on the road trips from state to state to visit family. So we know our ins and outs on travelling. 2. When I was a child, I would randomly hug strangers telling them I loved them. I was so filled with joy and love that it just spilled over to everyone. There was basically only one stranger I never immediately latched onto the second I saw them, being this story. So my mum was talking to me, and we're taking a visit to see some relatives while my dad was staying at home with brothers. So, she had to go to house sit, and in general is a better caretaker of me than my father, so it made sense I went with her. We were driving for hours until we finally hit a rest stop, and so got out to use the bathroom. Now, there was already this guy in the parking lot, and according to my mum, it looked like he was watching everyone who entered and left the rest stop. The second we get out of the car, he did too. My mum held my hands as we went into the restroom, but immediately picks up on the fact that I let go of her hand to hold the other, the way facing the man. Now looking back, she told me that it was clear somewhere in my tiny child brain that I picked up on some sign of danger, because I avoided this man as much as I possibly could and would quicken my pace to the restroom and car. I never did that with another stranger again. I had never blatantly avoided another adult like that. Anyway, as we do our business and head back to the car, the man had gone and left us, only then to follow us back in his own car. My mum immediately realised what was going on, trying to shake him off on the highway. He wouldn't budge, and tried to get as close as he could. Apparently while doing this, a semi-truck driver notices how frantic and off she was driving and could see her looking in the back. He realised what's going on and drove up to her side, making eye contact with her, and they're on the same page from then on out. Turns out, the driver called up on the radio to other truckers saying what was going on, and a bunch of drivers from different routes nearby came to the same highway that we're travelling on. A few minutes later, they began blocking out the other guy's car, and essentially trapped him away from my mum and I as she turned onto the next exit to find another rest stop, as the original truck driver follows us in. He got out and talked to my mum and told her he picked up what was happening, asking if we're okay, and drove with us to a Burger King and got something to eat. We talked and he got back onto the road until eventually we go separate ways. So to the guy who was probably going to kidnap me and my mum, thank God you never got a chance to, and thank God for the truck drivers who probably saved our lives. My dad works for a large printing company, and they completed an overnight rush job for a business. My dad got tasked with dropping the order off. It would take 8 hours each way to drop off the order. He was going to take my mum, as she's a retired teacher, and he figured it would be nice to have someone to drive each way. However, the night before he was going to leave my mum, he comes down with the flu. He left early the next morning and promises my mum if he gets tired, he's going to stop either at a restaurant or rest stop. So he made it without incident to drop off the papers. It's about noon when he set off again, and soon realises that the traffic's horrible. My dad decided that he'd take the long way home. It would add an hour or so, but he feared it would take longer to wait in the traffic. He drove straight for hours, until he realised he had to pee, and badly. My dad's a prostate cancer survivor, so needs to pee a lot. Also, he was starting to get sleepy and figured he should pull over and take a nap. It was winter, so about 4:30. Now it's winter and about 4:30, and the sun started to set, and he notices a stop ahead, quite glad to be able to rest. He pulls up. Now, he does a little stretch, calls my mum to tell her that he's stopping to stretch his legs and maybe catch a nap, then heads to the bathrooms. Now the place was pretty much deserted. There's an old Chevy pickup next to my dad, and there was an RV with a family packing up that was probably their dinner. He went into the bathroom and opened the first stall. He was in there doing his business when he hears someone talking. He thinks at first they're talking to him until he realizes that the person A is on the phone, or B, they're talking to themselves. It's okay. It's gonna be okay. We'll just take another one and then bring it to the mother, the man said, almost singing to himself. My dad said he sounded like he was young, between late teens to early 20s. Then, before my dad could say anything, he starts unzipping his pants, starting to get weird. The guy randomly starts screaming, smashing his head onto the mirror and then on the wall. He started screaming in a more high-pitched voice now. At that, my dad runs out of the stall and he quickly opens a bathroom door running to his car. He locks the car door when he notices a skinny young man running out of the bathroom. He's looking for my dad and sees his car. My dad starts the car and begins backing up when he literally runs full tilt at him, screaming. My dad drove off. He's so badly shaken up by this that he had to pull over to the next town just to relax. He was paying for his coffee when that same Chevy pulls up. My dad grabs his coffee and hides his face. The kid walks in, goes up to the nice older cashier who my dad brought coffee from, throws his arms around this woman and starts sobbing about how he's sorry, mother, and how he let another one get away. My dad's heard more than enough now and quickly tosses his coffee away and quickly sprints to his car and makes it home safely. To this day, my dad refuses to stop at any rest stops now. He only stops at major places you can actually pull over at. So my first story is actually my friend's story. So during these times, things took place when we were all in high school. I already knew about skinwalkers and the like, but when these things happened to me, I wasn't sure if it really was a skinwalker at the time or something else. I've noticed that most of the people who tell me they've experienced the same phenomenon live in the same area that I do, and my friend is no exception. Let's call him Jay. Jay lives maybe 5 minutes away from me. She told me that in her bus, there's this one area that they drive by to drop this kid off. She said she doesn't know why, but it always gives her the creeps. She told me that one early morning, when they were driving in this area to pick him up, all the kids in the bus saw this deer running alongside the bus. Not away from it, but besides it. She said it looked weird as hell. You know, the usual stuff about appearing humanoid. And it didn't look right. Like its limbs were awkwardly bent in a way that didn't seem human. And its eyes were freaky. This is my friend who doesn't know anything about skinwalkers or anything of that mumbo jumbo. So I basically get chills. I tried being reasonable though, because you know, maybe she just saw a regular deer, and since it was dark out, she just got confused, because it's Florida. We're not supposed to get that kind of thing down here. However, Jay swore up and down that it was not a normal deer. She said they all saw it and the bus driver slowed down to get a better look because everyone was weirded out by it, and it was basically something they've never seen before. After a while it ran off to disappear. Jay could have made this up, but like I said, why would she, and she's never seen anything like it. So anyway, I get freaked out because here I am knowing about this frickin' skinwalker, and my friend is literally clueless, thinking it's just a regular weird animal and she's just had a weird experience. Oh god. I ask her, do you even know what skinwalkers are? She just looked at me and said, what's that? I googled it and showed her the deceptions of skinwalkers, and she said, that's what I saw, but it had the head of a deer. She kept on saying it didn't look human or like an animal. After a while too, the kid from that bus stop didn't come back. Although that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with this, I just thought it was weird. So we were freaking out together, because What she said reminded me about what I heard at night, about it not being animal or human. See, a couple of years back, before she told me the story, I found myself one night sitting in my backyard like really early, maybe 3 in the morning or so, because I was thinking about things due to personal reasons. And I'm kinda just chilling and enjoying the silence when all of a sudden I hear this really freaky echoing scream from far away. The only way I can describe it as though that a woman and a cat were trapped together inside of a bag, screaming like they're getting murdered. I know mountain lions, foxes and owls are a thing, and they make the weirdest calls, but I looked up that stuff and it's just not the same. Like, usually you wouldn't be able to tell if it's an animal, right? It's just common sense, like my friend said. But that don't sound like animal or human. It sounded really unnatural and weird. Now, me being me, I was really upset at first. Now, the thing was really far away, and I actually thought that they might even be killing someone in the streets at 3 AM. That thing travelled so fast though. It sounded freaky as hell, and it was getting closer as it got to the more weird and unnatural sound. It only took me a couple of seconds to realise that this isn't a woman and this ain't a cat. Because while this was going down, I was going through it in my head like, what the hell is that thing? The first thing went from sounding like a good couple of miles away to being in my goddamn neighbourhood in 5 seconds. It was so weird because 1 second it sounded far away, and the next it's on my street. I had a heart attack. The second I stood up, the scream just stopped, just like it started. And I'm really thinking at this point that it must be in front of my house. I walk as calmly as possible back inside, locking the doors, and the scream was back again, far away. I also heard some scraping and tapping sounds on my windows, but it happens at the same time now. I'd say 2 to 4 o'clock in the morning, and seen some black figures that aren't really affected by light outside of my house. To add detail to those things so you can get a feel for it, basically what happened is that I was doing a project for class, and since I procrastinate like I'm a pro up until 2 AM, I go to wash my hands from all the graphite, and the water's running while I hear a scraping sound against one of the bedroom doors that leads to my backyard. Now, most of the door is made up of these glass panes. They kinda make everything appear distorted and like blobby ash lumps. But then I see something pointy, dark against the window, almost looking ghost-like. I turn off the water and wait a bit, and it comes back and scrapes against the window again. I'm not trying to freak out, but my hands are shaking. It's stupid, but I actually whisper, "What are you doing?" while my voice trembled, and it stopped. I stop, and I don't hear anything except for what sounded like somebody walking by the window to the house every now and then. It continued that way for some nights too. Off and on, I would be hearing footsteps by my window, and even a tap on the window. Sometimes I ignored them, and other times I look out to see who's there, but I never see anyone. Another night I'd been outside in my backyard again, after having a rough day. It was maybe 3 or so AM in the morning. I'm sitting outside on the trampoline relaxing. I suddenly notice it's quiet, like kind of uneasy silence that feels like a vacuum. I get this feeling of dread, like I'm being watched, and I snap my head to the left and catch a glimpse of a humanoid dark figure under the side of my fence immediately. I'm a little freaked out because I notice that this thing is pure black. The streetlight hits it, but didn't do anything at all. It almost looked cartoony, if that makes any sense, because it's like the laws of physics don't apply to this thing. See, the reason I'm ranting about this is that I told both my friends my own story in psychology class at the same time. A lot of kids there live around my area. I mean like 5 to 15 max away. And they all start screaming, and the entire class went crazy when I finished because apparently they've all experienced the exact same thing as me. One girl told me about also hearing the tapping on her window at night. Another one told me about a really dark figure that seemed to follow her at night time, also screaming from the woods. Pretty much everyone's heard the screaming. It sounded the same, but that's the thing. In completely different time frames. That's the weird part, because everyone's voice sounds different. So how could she describe the same thing I did? You know, like, if people were really killing each other out there, none of us thought it was an animal either. We all agreed from that point our town is pretty haunted, but I don't know. I mean, if there's any animal that sounded like that, I want to know, because that didn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. I want to be enlightened, I want it to be something normal, but I just don't think it can be. The only person I heard of who's seen anything remotely specific is my friend's best friend from art school, who went on the bus, and apparently, like, it's really bad to talk about skinwalkers, and even worse, if you see them, it's like bad mojo. These things are said to be able to travel very quickly, so thinking about that made it seem like we experienced a skinwalker. Okay, so I had this saved in my notes for a while, but today I just asked my co-worker, who was also my friend in high school who lives nearby. He got all spooked and said that he's heard and seen the same things, but he's very spiritual and often has visions. He told me that he believes they're doing dark magic in the woods because of a dream he had about some hooded up group sacrificing a woman and a cat. Which is freaky because it also turns out that behind our local dog park, there's a patch of woods with dodgy stuff going down there. I was shown this by an acquaintance during my freshman year who lives a couple of streets away. Down the path in the woods, after some time of walking, there's this huge cross smack bang in the middle of nowhere. It's basically raw. Some crooked old nails struck together with a rope hanging from where you'd put your hands to be crucified. It's huge too, and whenever I decide to check it out, I have this horrible feeling like I don't want to be there or something bad's gonna happen. Anyway, he says I'm not the first person that he knows has told him about experiencing these things. He's also had his experience while there with humanoid figures. He says that he saw one turn around and look at him, directly in the eyes as though it was trying to intimidate him before vanishing. So we basically don't mess with anything in the woods near me. My father died about 5 years ago, unexpectedly from a heart attack. To say it was hard on my mother would be an understatement. Our old house in Knoxville just didn't feel the same anymore, and about a year later, my mum and I made plans to take ourselves and an elderly dog, Ace, to move further south to a small town situated about half an hour from Atlanta. just a few days before we slated to move, I had one of the most vivid dreams I've ever come to experience. All that was within my dream was my bedroom, a picture-perfect recreation of the real thing. I sometimes wonder if it was a sleep paralysis. To further add to the dream's realism, in the middle of the night, the street lights come on across the street that illuminate my window, creating a reflection on the wall perpendicular. In my dream, as I lay there, staring at the exact reflection on the wall, I saw an orb of smoke fade in from the shadows. Goosebumps chill across my skin as I lay there panicked, afraid to move a muscle. Suddenly it stopped moving and steadily hung in the light's reflection as though staring at me. Without a warning, it spoke to me in my dad's voice. "I'm sending something to watch you." Despite hearing my father's voice from the orb, I'm terrified, and I don't know why. "What?" I whisper. The orb remains silent, leaving an eerily dead silence in the voice. "Damn, black." I woke up almost instantaneously. I'm gasping for breath now. The nightmare had chilled me to my core. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, especially the final words. I chalked it up to my dad wishing well on us maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling. With the next couple of weeks, my mum and I moved out of Knoxville and headed down to South Georgia. She had managed to find a quaint little house for us. It had only 1 or 2 neighbours down there, and it's down the middle of a long gravel road in the middle of the woods. Nice for us. Probably the best reliever of all my stresses came with the move, however, was our neighbour's cat. She was a petite, older black cat that gravitated towards me almost instantly, and I treated her as though she's my own. I left out a can of food once or twice a week for her. Even if I didn't call out for her, when she saw me outside, she'd run up to me, helping ease my tensions. Less than a month into our new house, I suddenly awoken to a faint coughing that sounded like it is coming from downstairs. The important thing to know about our dog is that he has a collapsed trachea. He needs medicine to calm the condition down. So I'm used to walking up in the middle of the night to get his medicine. I proceed downstairs from my bedroom to give him his cough medicine, but I couldn't find him anywhere through the house. He wasn't in his bed sleeping, and he wasn't in the kitchen. I mean, literally nowhere to be found. I didn't check my mum's room, however, as I didn't want to wake her up. Besides, I wouldn't have heard the coughing if he had been in there anyway, so I just let it be. That's when I heard the coughing again, but it was coming from further away. It's outside now. I look over to the side door patio leading to the woodlands, and realised I'd forgotten to shut it. There it stood, slightly ajar. He got out. I immediately ran outside with a flashlight and started calling out for my dog. "Ace! Ace!" I shouted out into the neighbouring woods. I heard another cough and shined my light in its direction. That time, it had echoed from down the gravel road. I swear, a path had never looked so terrifyingly desolate before in my life. I stared down that long gravel road that led us to our new home, but in that moment, I thought my dog was lost, and chalk it up to the new house jitters. I go, "Ace, come on," pressing on. But then I heard it, the cough I'd been following, almost right beside me, but this time, it didn't stay a dry cough like it had been before. Instead, It slowly descended into a low growl. I shined my light towards the sound. There stood a bright red fox in the middle of the path. For a moment, I figured it's the fox that I'd mistaken for my dog. The whole time, as I was processing what I was seeing, it stared directly at me, its eyes glowing. However, our stare was broke when it tilted its head to the right, looking down, and there was our neighbour's little black cat staring beside me. However, it had completely changed its persona, no longer happy, affectionate, not the cat I knew. Instead, it arched its back upright, every fibre of her hair standing uneasily, uttering the lowest growl I've ever heard from a feline. In that moment, I figured she's just scared of the fox, so I knelt down beside her in a bid to coax her away and avoid fox hunting her. But no matter how many times I tried to coax her out of fight mode, she wouldn't. That's when I looked towards the direction of the fox once more, but there wasn't a fox anymore. Instead, in the exact same spot of the gravel road, was a walking, rotten corpse of a coyote roadkill, slowly moving towards me. It took a step back. I'm absolutely mortified of what I'm seeing. Its jaws hanging loose, eyes are blood-stained, wobbling now. I rub my eyes in disbelief, hoping I'm imagining it. But it was there, and it was real. And despite what was in front of us, the black cat just kept on growling at me. Suddenly, it stopped. The creature had ceased its walk towards me. For a moment, it just stood there, glancing back and forth between myself and this little black cat that was trying to defend me. I now realise. That's when I mistakenly heard this beast mutter two words almost. Damn black. In a flash, the creature ran straight into the woods. I shined my flashlight in its direction, but it's completely vanished. Even the brush it came from looked untouched. That's when the cat standing behind me calmed herself down. Almost as though nothing happened, she rubbed herself against my leg, returning to normal, now in a very loving state and manner. Despite technically not being mine, I scoop her up and run back inside the house and upstairs with the little black cat snuggled up in my arms. I decide to poke my head into my mum's room. Lying on the floor, sound asleep, is Ace, who had been here the whole time. I quietly close her door before bolting upstairs, making sure the little cat slept with me that night. From the research I've done, I am almost certain that I was a victim of a skinwalker. Okay, I posted a skinwalker encounter yesterday. I found it helped me, getting it off my chest and out into the open. Now this story goes into some of the details about injuries. The details are not too bad in my opinion, but you've had your warning. Now for some background, I was 16, around 2016 when this happened. I live in Massachusetts, which is where this happened. The day starts normally. I went to school, had a test in vet tech, and I took the bus home. Both my parents were at work like normal, but after 3 hours when my mum should have been home, I got worried. Around 5 PM, I got a phone call from my dad who told me that my mum's in a car accident and they're both in the hospital and they're gonna be there for a while. It got very late, almost 10, and my parents weren't home, so I decided to put my younger brothers to bed. I stayed up waiting for my parents to get home. I spent my time reading and writing an essay for school until around 1 in the morning. I got a call from my dad who said that he wasn't coming home. He was staying in a motel that was closer to the hospital. I just got off the phone and finished that part of the essay that I was on. I gather my stuff and walk through the kitchen, heading towards the stairs that leads upstairs when a terrifying loud moaning screeches through my ears. The moaning came from outside. I mean, it's super loud, but would stop occasionally. Like whatever it was had a voice crack, almost sounding pained. I turn on the outside light to see an ugly sight. Sitting in the yard just feet from my house is a coyote, horribly injured. Its head's caved in, its paws bleeding. This was evident by the pool of blood. It appeared that it had a long, deep gash all down its back. I reach in my pocket going for my phone, only to realise I left it on the table I'd been working on. Oh God. I turn and rush back to the table. I was planning on calling a local vet clinic that I knew was open 24/7. When I reached the table, the moaning got much louder and more pained. Then it stopped. I grabbed my phone and ran back to the window. At first I was confused as hell. The coyote's gone, replaced by a common tabby cat. It was odd. The cat was sitting in exactly the same place that the coyote was sitting in. Weird. After the initial shock, I noticed that the tabby cat had the exact same injuries. Same part of the head caved in, same bleeding and gashes. Now I couldn't pinpoint the difference for a good few minutes, but then I realised that on the right shoulder blade it is exactly the same. I dropped my phone. As soon as my phone hit the floor, the cat starts meowing loudly. I'm now stuck here terrified as it meows at me. It's not even blinking. After a good 10 minutes, I slowly pick up my phone off the floor. I straighten back up and look out the window, and the cat's gone. It had only gone for a few seconds, and in that short time, it vanished. Some unknowing feeling come over me. I don't know what it was. Worry for the animal? Curiosity? Maybe. Hell, it might have been something that the animal made me feel. I have no clue. Now outside, I first walked to the blood puddle and looked for a trail of blood, and I found it. I started to follow the trail and found that it ended as soon as it got past the gates. To make sure that I just couldn't see it in the dark, I pulled out my phone and illuminated the ground. I looked for 5 minutes and don't find anything. Like the cat and trail had vanished. I called the veterinary clinic and they sent out a car. They look around for things, but they can't find anything. At the time I didn't think anything of this, but thereafter I realised there's no trail of blood leading to my house. I have no idea what this thing was. None of my searches have come up with anything. I'm honestly completely dumbfounded as to what this creature was. I only hope it wasn't a skinwalker attacking these. My wife and I were driving through the northern part of Arizona on Highway 89 between Flagstaff and Page. It's about 1 AM, as we're on the third shift at the time and often drove at night to avoid traffic. I saw a few set of eyes glowing in my headlights a little ways up the road, so I let off the gas, slowing down to avoid hitting an animal in the road. When we drove by, we see several dogs or coyotes on the side of the road, and I hit the gas and drove by. After we passed, my wife said, "One of them was running next to my car," and I looked over and saw it, probably 20 feet off the shoulder of the road. I floored it, and I see that it stood up on its own hind legs and kept pace with us for a couple of seconds before turning away from the road and disappearing. The whole event probably lasted no more than 15 seconds, but God, it is the most terrifying 15 seconds of my life. This was probably 20 years ago, and we still rarely talk about it. We live in a rural community on the Navajo reservation. My aunt and her 2 brothers were home alone while my grandparents had left for the evening to attend a chapter house meeting. They were in the house, and like many people from the reservation, they don't have electricity, and like many people there, they've been outside in the dark for about an hour, and my aunts and uncles are getting ready for bed. Outside, they hear noises, as though someone is moving things around them. My oldest uncle then went outside to see what's going on, and he saw a figure outside the truck. This was immensely out of the ordinary because the closest neighbour is miles away. Whatever it was opened the truck door and began to dig through personal items. My uncles and aunts were frightened by the sight and knew they must take action. They took out the rifle and steadied themselves to hold it up. They flung open the door, aiming the gun at the figure in the dark. They're shaken at this point. The figure then turned and starts towards them, totally unfazed by the weapon. My uncle pulled the trigger, but nothing happens. The figure drew closer and my aunt began to smell something like a rotten corpse. It's so strong she began to gag. My uncle continued to pull the trigger, no luck. The figure came closer and closer, but now, off in the distance, headlights are approaching. My grandparents are returning. The figure looks towards the lights and starts to move away and tucked itself behind a tree near the home. My oldest uncle ran towards a truck with the gun. My grandfather got out of the car and my uncle pointed to the tree. That thing was poking out its head to observe what they're doing. My grandfather ran into the house and over to the stove, grabbing a handful of ashes and rubbing it over the gun, and placed an ash-covered bullet to the chamber. He walked out onto the porch and fired towards a tree. Whatever that thing was did not expect the gun to go off. The gunshot echoed, and the figure began running. My grandpa chased my aunt inside, and my uncles and grandfather went after it. There weren't many roads or paths, so as my grandfather and uncles chased after the figure, the truck was bouncing and the headlights were not fixed on one particular spot. My uncle swears that whenever the headlights would hit, the figure he saw a woman. Not only that, whatever it was running on its fours like a bear. My grandfather must stop now as they're nearing a ditch with a 30-feet drop. He got out and began to yell in Navajo. My uncle says that he was yelling about a local woman. He yelled that he wasn't scared and he knew it was her to leave the family alone. After a few days, there was the news that the woman that my grandfather was yelling about had passed. I've always been told that if you know who the skinwalker is, say their name and it will kill them. Out on the Navajo reservation, we don't have the city come and collect our trash, so we have to burn the trash out in these huge burning barrels. Not very eco-friendly, I know, but it's what we have to do. Now if you don't light the trash properly, the fire will go out and the trash will sit in the barrel. This is important because we are told to dispose of personal hygiene items. If you removed all your hair from your brush, make sure the trash burned. If it was that time, you had to make sure everything was burned. They tell us things because skinwalkers have been known to dig through trash in order to find out things they can use against us. They use the things that were briefly connected to bring misfortune onto others. Some of my family members take part in the sport of rodeo, so to practice, they have a dummy rope and throw it at things and try to bring them in. My two male cousins were enjoying themselves outside, taking turns swinging the rope at the fake calf. The elders are always adamant that we shouldn't stay up past sundown, where that it's pitch black for miles. But my cousins aren't superstitious and are under streetlight. My cousins are joking and laughing, having a great time. That changes when the oldest cousin looks over to a burn barrel. A dark figure is bent over, rummaging through the garbage that's failed to burn. My cousins devise a plan that they're gonna grab weapons and chase it. They move strategically so that they are able to flank the figure. They run full speed at it and begin yelling and swinging. My cousin states that they kept this up for the most part, until the figure ran under the streetlight. But that's when my cousins see that what they thought was actually a person is actually a goat. Why would they think it is a person? The goat was running on its hind legs. Fear runs through their bodies as the figure runs off into the darkness. Now feeling nervous, and not entirely accepting what they've just seen, they began roping the dummy again. There's an awkward silence amongst the boys who just saw something unnatural, but talking about it now would just make it seem real. The boys roped in silence until one of them looked over to a tree. There's a head peeking out at them. If they didn't pay attention to it, whatever it was would poke its head out from the tree to stare. When they would look in the direction of the tree, it would move quickly out of sight. This was the final straw. My cousins ran back into the house. They told their parents and my uncle come out. It was still there, poking its head from behind a tree. My uncle loaded up his gun and starts walking towards the tree line. He aimed it and pulled the trigger. Gun jammed. Whatever it was began to run so fast it appeared to be a blur. When it left, my uncle came in and gave the boys a thorough lecture about staying out late. One of my cousins then told my uncle that whatever it was had been digging through the trash barrel. They went to investigate the creature that's hauled a lot of things out of the barrel, which was odd. There were tracks all around the area. They followed the tracks, but they suddenly vanish, dead in the middle of nowhere, with no possible way they could have went. The Navajo Reservation is the largest reservation in the United States. It goes into New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. This story takes place in the northeast region of Arizona, near Indian Wells. This was told by people from around that area. If you're heading west on State Highway 15, out towards Dilton, you come to a stretch of road that goes into a small valley. I remember going down this road in my youth. If you ever looked at the horizon, it would seem as if the road kept going. Then suddenly your car would be pulled down by gravity as though being followed by the road. It would always give me butterflies when we would get to the drop. When I heard about this story, it made my stomach feel different. A man was driving home one night and it's very late. It was a drive that he had done before, so he wasn't bothered by it. When you're driving on the reservation, sometimes there isn't any way to keep cattle from getting on the road. No fences means that you need to be extra aware. I always get told to look out for black horses. If you see a black horse, then you'll be able to see anything else that may wander into the path of your vehicle. So this man is driving home, not really paying much attention. He drives down the slope, but when he gets to the bottom of the valley, he sees it. He doesn't have time to react. Suddenly, a horse comes out of the darkness. He slams his brakes but can't stop. The impact is enough to deploy the airbags. The man is tossed around a bit. He turns on the emergency lights and gets out of the car to assess damage. The front of the car is crumpled and one of the headlights is destroyed. He cursed out loud. This was the worst place to have an accident. He didn't have signal for help. Then he thinks of the horse. This man went into his cab and got a small keychain flashlight. He starts shining around looking for the animal. He heard noises, but they don't sound like a horse. But he was absolutely positive that he hit a horse. As he approaches the sounds, he could see the animal's fur moving from its ragged breathing. As he got closer, he began to realize what it was. An elderly woman wrapped in a large spelt. She was moaning from pain. The man stopped dead in his tracks due to fear. He stumbled back to his truck. Although it suffered plenty of damage, he was able to drive off. Once he got signal again, he called the authorities. An ambulance drove out there and recovered her. She's then driven to the local care facility. Due to the fact that many of the healthcare staff were Navajo, no one wanted to touch the woman. The woman known in the community was thought to be bedridden. This was shocking because she was so far from home, and the state she was in was off-putting. She had on her attire when she arrived. The nurses called her family to come in. When she got there, they removed her jewelry. When her family got there, they were frightened. But there was some non-Navajo staff in there that provided care. She only had bumps and scrapes, which didn't make any sense at all. She's able to get up and walk around the same evening. She went home with her family that night, but apparently vanished after a few days. In Navajo culture, if you find out who a skinwalker is, you have the power to destroy them. After the community around India Wells found out, or more fittingly who she was, it was certain that her end come. I had pet rabbits as a kid. They lived outside in a cage, a really big cage inside like a bigger shed, so they had a pretty good life. But I went out with my older sister to feed them. At the time we were about 5 or 7. On the way out to the cage, we both saw what appeared to be a really tall man running inhumanly fast through our backyard. We live in what is basically a swamp, and had to have cleared this giant downed tree and run over mud and ferns. But regardless, he seems to be going through at least 20 miles per hour. We both dropped what we had and bolt inside. At the time our parents are able to convince us it's a deer. We wanted to believe them, but it just wasn't. I convinced myself for over a decade that that's what we saw. Fast forward to a few years ago, I was at a park near my house with my friend late at night. I pulled into the dirt road drive in my Outback and parked facing the old practice fence. Now we go to the field that was too foggy to see across, except for a split second. We can see what appeared to be a very tall man running across the field. We drove as fast as that Subaru could take us out that park. Now a couple of years ago, I was at the same park under similar circumstances. This time, it was clear but very windy. Now from across the field and into a field, we heard a crash and a scream. Not a crash then a scream, but simultaneous. It was the most shrill, terrifying, god-awful screech I've ever heard. More human than a fisher cat, but far louder and more sinister. Again, we noped it out of there as quick as possible. So for context, I live in southern Maryland on a large plot of land. We have 3 large farm dogs, 2 of whom are German Shepherds. They're very used to the various animals that pursue our property, and very rarely get spooked or upset. We also have lots of livestock, and it's uncommon for us to lose a random animal or find a pile of chicken feathers in the corner of our property. However, we've always been able to explain it or add extra protection for our flocks. Around 8 months ago, we started losing chickens at an alarming rate. They would disappear. Even our shepherds couldn't send them anywhere on the property. For a while, we figured it's just a barred owl or some other bird of prey. The main problem with that theory is that literally 10 would disappear at a time rather than the normal 1 or 2. We decided to put a trail cam up to watch our most eastern flock. Almost immediately, the problem stopped, so we took them down. But then it got stranger. I've always gotten sleep paralysis, and it's like to believe I'm pretty comfortable with my sleep paralysis demon. It's never really been something to concern me. However, around the same time as we started losing chickens, I would see something different in my sleep paralysis. Whereas my demon would chill in the corner and not move, this thing would hang around and move back and forth, almost like a sloth. It had long fingers and was really skinny, like, weirdly. It didn't appear human. I then noticed that it constantly stared at me, whatever part of the room I was in. At the time, I decided not to worry though, and figure it's just anxiety. Which brings us up to September 2018. One night at around 2, I woke up completely able to move my body. Everything seemed normal. No one else was sleeping in the house that night, but that's pretty standard around that time of year. I glanced up at my rafters and saw the long-fingered thing moving and looking at me. Immediately I turn on my bed lamp. It's gone, yet again. I talk it up to stress and decide to go downstairs to grab a cup of water. All of our dogs are happily asleep, and I went back to bed turning off the light. The second it was dark, I could see it again, without my eyes having to adjust. This freaked me out enough, but all of a sudden I heard a Rottweiler get up and start growling. He barks and growls. I call out, but he kept going. He got louder and louder until the other dogs joined in. Now, I turned the light back on, grabbing my hunting rifle. I went downstairs and took 2 of the dogs outside, and I swear to God, I've never heard a silent night like it. I moved my flashlight slowly around the perimeter looking for the shine of eyes, or anything. All of a sudden, the chickens are going haywire. like so loud they distract the dogs, who sprinted out towards them. I followed them only to find no chickens, and our fence is torn down. There's no animals in the area that could even try to do that, so we quickly get inside and camped out for the evening. It was quiet after that, and when the morning came, the chickens are safely back home. I stupidly figured the problem solved and decided not to worry about it. The only thing was that I started seeing the long-fingered rafter thing every time I turned out the lights. Eventually I get so freaked out, I decide to call a shaman. She told us that we have a Wendigo problem, that she would come and sage the house. We opened every single window and door, letting her do her thing, but since then, we've had no problems. The issue now is that when we walk our dogs at night, or put the chickens inside, I swear someone's watching me. I've had a couple of other people bring up that they feel weird at night, and nobody goes outside alone anymore. Whenever we walk our dogs at night, they get so paranoid and don't want to move, especially not towards the forest. The creepiest part though is sometimes at night, we hear screaming. We assume it's often coyotes, but every once in a while, it's just off enough that we get scared. A couple of times it's been a lone shriek, which is very uncommon for foxes or coyotes, and a few nights ago, we were asleep in bed when we heard a scream from directly outside our window. My partner says that he's worried that someone was hurt, so he opened our window and yells, "Is anyone out there?" And we hear a lot of shuffling, like somebody scrambling off. It sounded heavier than a bird of prey, but way lighter than a person. Our dog stopped barking, and within a minute, we hear another scream a good mile away. First encounter was about 10 years ago. I had set up along a clearing and was a good 20 feet up in a tree. As dawn was approaching, I had a large 12-point buck slowly coming into the clearing about 400 yards off. I let it come closer and took aim and shot it in the kill zone through the heart with a 30.06195 grain ballistic tripped round. After watching it fall through my scope, I slung my gun, getting ready to climb down. And then, I watched this deer get up, running back into the woods on two legs. I have no idea what happened, but had heard of skinwalkers in my youth from my grandmother, so I noped out of there immediately. A few years later, I was in the same hunting area. I had set up my stand and ladder the previous day, and around midnight hiked out to my stand so I could be ready for dawn. I got into my stand at around 2 AM and was waiting patiently. After a couple of hours around 6 AM, 30 minutes till sunup, I heard something grab a hold of my ladder. Then it sounded like something was climbing my ladder. I pointed my rifle straight down and fired. I hit something on my first shot and heard a scream. So I naturally emptied the rifle, still pointing straight down the ladder. I didn't dare look down for fear of what I had heard in stories of locking eyes with these beasts. I pulled out my .357 mag revolver, proceeding to empty the cylinder towards the sound of movement again. Once that was spent, I reloaded it, continuing my barrage. There was still something out there and I could hear it. I had one bullet left. I pull out my 9mm that I kept with me. I fire a few rounds towards the noise. Then, I wait till the morning. A few rounds left in my 9mm, clutching it for dear life. When morning came, I look at my surroundings and climb out of my tree. Around my tree stand was a darkish blood, and it went off deeper into the woods. I hiked to the trail as fast as I can. When I got there, I saw someone else in the distance. He was going the same direction I was. He also looked scared. I reloaded everything while he was closing the distance. Once he got closer, I asked him if he's heading out too. He told me he heard a lot of gunshots and a scream. I asked him where the post was. He points in the direction where the blood trail goes. He said he heard something running by him after the gunshot stopped, and when dawn hit, saw something animist running around on 2 legs. I got his name. We'll call him Jim, and he told me that we should get out of the woods. He was a native to the area and half Cherokee, and told me if he saw what I saw, he would leave immediately. So we get out of the woods. Surprisingly, we both park in the same area and share a beer, and around noon, we summoned up the courage to go back for our things. After a slow hike, when we went to my stand first, my steel ladder that was secured by ratchet straps and bungees to the tree is literally ripped from the tree. It was bent and torn up. My tree stand is still in that tree to this day, I assume. He looked at the blood trail and went white. The tracks are a mix of human and canine. We made it to his tree stand after a bit. He was only 800 feet from where I was, amazingly. His gear, strewn across the forest floor like mine, a bent ladder, but unlike my tree stand, his had been ripped from the tree. We both left the area and went back to our vehicles. So after that encounter, Jim and me traded phone numbers and hung out. Whenever I went to hunt, we'd do this. But it kind of become a thing to go hunting together now. He knew the woods better than I did. He was good company. And about 2 years after the incident that caused us to meet, we're posted up in a blind cage in a clearing. We generally put our stands close, or hunted back to back in a blind over the 2 years we hunted together. If one of us had a shot when we're in a blind, we would signal to the other with a tap from our elbows. That morning, we both had a shot. We both fired. I hit a doe. I was aiming square in the chest. As it went down, it turns and runs on its back legs, dead sprinting into the woods. Jim's quarry did the same thing after he hit it. We went to investigate, and once the animals turned, the hoof sprinters got larger, and then changed to human tracks. Jim said we have to leave, and I'm not going to disagree with him. We both stopped hunting in the woods after that encounter. I have no clue to this day what happened in those woods. I've heard of skinwalkers before, but from what I can tell, they're far more durable. I mean, I used a 30.06 with 195 grain ballistic tip rounds every time I go hunting. Nothing should be able to survive that, especially where I hit them. But those are my stories. I hope to God I don't get any more. The area that we lived in initially was a slightly out of town neighbourhood near a park that was a sacred site to the tribe of the Anzi before them. Because of its location, it was a bit isolated and the homes were all company owned. I mean, most of them had stood empty for quite a while, to be honest. But the company that my SO worked for at the time had just started opening them up for their employees. There were maybe 15 homes in this little pocket neighbourhood with lots of space between them, and only 3 of them had anybody actually living in them, including ours. On our street, there was a single empty house across the street, some basketball courts next door, an empty house next door to that, and an occupied home at the very top of the road with its back to the park. Now the streets out on the Navajo Res are pretty dark, even in neighborhoods. For this long road, there were just 2 street lights, one at the bottom and, one at the top. So being in the middle is quite dark and pretty awesome to stargazing at the same time. Our house is nestled at the bottom at the steep slope, so the road in front of us is up a 6-foot ridge. I'd been out there for less than a year when it all started. I was a smoker, so I'd go out in the evenings to smoke, and I'd sit outside on my bench, smoke a cigarette and bounce between them, looking at the stars, checking around my feet for scorpions. The first thing I ever noticed was hearing a kind of mad and chaotic flute sound. It sounded like somebody had a recorder and told a toddler, "Play it now." Some poor parents in this practically empty neighborhood had given their kid a recorder and were being tortured with it. God damn. I kind of laughed at their imagined misery and didn't think much of it. The next night, at around 9:30 again, I heard the same flute sound. Laughing at the poor parents, I don't think much of it, but it's the same after that. On the 4th night, however, I was up later than usual and went outside to smoke a cigarette. I heard a whoop sound coming from the basketball court where the next door neighbours are, but I can't figure out where the sound's coming from. It appears to be a small pocket of trees, but I'm not certain. It sounded distinctly human, so I decided to call it a night and go to bed. The following night, I went outside for a cigarette and was sitting there when I saw something small and distinct moving through the trees, but on the road. I sat there smoking, watching it, trying to figure out what this thing was. I wasn't too worried because my SO was awake in the front room with the front door open, and if anything was going to whoop me at the time, he would be there in a second. Whatever it was though doesn't look human. It was far too small and low to the ground, so I just watched it, curious to see what it was. Now its fur is very light coloured. When it cleared the trees, it actually started to casually continue up the road in front of my house. I figured that, yeah, it's a cat because of the size and colour. Now I think to myself, there's no way it can be anything else. I mean, it has to be a cat. To me, it looked like somebody's cat's gotten out of their home and just got lost or something. I start to get worried about it though, because the house at the top of the road has some big dogs living there, so I put my cigarette out and decided that an investigation's in order. I made my way up my driveway and slowly tried to catch up with the cat because I don't want to scare it and send it running straight into the dogs where it'll meet its fate. There didn't seem to be much of a rush though, as the cat had taken a meandering on the road ahead of me, so I start calling it softly, trying to coax it over to me so I can rescue the poor thing. When I get within 10 feet of it, however, I realise that there's something seriously wrong with it. It had no tail, its body is lumpy and odd. It looked as though it's floating above the ground instead of walking on it, and its legs swung back and forth rhythmically instead of stepping. The head didn't even appear to have ears. I feel absolute terror. I have no idea what I'm looking at, because this is not right. Something about the whole situation is just off. I've run down the driveway, having my hand on the screen door to go inside when I stop myself and turn to look at it one more time. The not cat had stopped where I'd been sitting, with the ridge and a chain link fence between us now. I then run inside. I figured it was safe to keep watching it because I must figure out what it is at least, surely. I let the screen door go and turned to watch. After a few seconds, the not cat started working its way up the road again towards a house at the top. Just before it got to where the lights from the streetlight shone down though, it stopped in the dim light and started to roll around furiously in the clay. All I could see was fur and dust. But then it stopped and rose up, this time appearing much larger than the cat before. It moved into the light, and that's when I saw what appeared to be an elderly woman. She slowly walked on all fours and quickly positioned herself directly under the streetlight, then crouching down to stare at me. I don't know how long we stared at each other for, but to that point, my SO spotted me outside the door, totally frozen, coming out to investigate. I don't say a word, and he looked over at where I was staring. I'm now uttering some weird, scared obscenities. He grabbed me and dragged me into the house, closing the door behind me. He was Navajo, so was pretty upset that I was gawking at a skinwalker instead of running inside and locking the door behind me like a sensible person. He was even more livid when he found out that I had actually thought it was a cat trying to capture it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and had to deal with my gaming friends and even my mother, who knew I never done drugs or drank before, implying that I was somehow either drunk or high from this experience. Thanks, Mum. The rules totally changed after that night. I wasn't allowed to go outside anymore without my SO, and never after he went to bed. On our next visit shortly after this, we were eating dinner in the kitchen when my cat very uncharacteristically jumps on me. He's never done this before. He climbs on my shoulder and starts hissing and growling at something behind me. The only thing behind me was the laundry room with a small little window, and my SO and eldest saw the past gloopy white face of a skinwalker peering through it, watching us eat dinner. This can't be real. All we could really do was shut the door to the laundry room and not go outside. Out on the res where we were at, the garbage cans were kept in these elevated cages to keep animals, especially wild dogs, from knocking them over. The next morning, we came out to find our garbage cans are completely rifted through. When we put them back, we spotted dusty mountain lion tracks on top of one of the lids. To me, this is really interesting because it wasn't a random collection of paws like you'd imagine from an animal working up there knocking it over. No. They were neatly lined up, like the mountain lion was a bunny scrolling across the top of it. They were definitely not legitimate animal tracks, but more like somebody stamped to the top with a mountain lion paw. It was at this point that my SO decided that we need to contact a medicine man. What we didn't know at the time was that during all of this, my eldest had woken up in the middle of the night and thought he heard me, so turned on his light to come and see me. It took him at least 15 years to tell me about this, but apparently, when he come out of his room, he realised our door was shut and the lights were all off in the house. He looked down the hall and saw two dimly glowing red eyes. He did what any 6-year-old does and closed the door and hid. Anyway, my SO called his uncle, whose father was a medicine man, and told him what we were seeing. Our medicine man was a crystal gazer and singer and was really interesting. We didn't tell him anything about what we had seen at all, but somehow he knew everything. He knew that I had seen this very unusual coloured fur and told us that the skinwalker that I had seen was actually the head of the locals. She's very old, and the one to wear the fur. Her purpose out there that night was to teach the youngers how to be better predators. Unfortunately for us, because I reacted the way I did, the elderly skinwalker decided that I must have power that she's not seen before, so there was nothing we could do. She's now interested. She wanted to find out what my power was, and if I posed any threat to her. If I don't, then she's gonna try and kill me and take my power. Luckily for me, I didn't have a power other than an equal measure of abject stupidity and curiosity. Unlucky for us, because of this, she never figured out what my power was, and she's maybe resentful for the fact that I got completely duped and rushed inside thereafter. It didn't matter what the house we lived in from that moment on. The flute started up at night, and thereafter, skinwalkers would appear. My father owns a small delivery service that operates out of Farmington, NM. We mostly deliver small packages out to the middle of nowhere that are too much of a hassle for large delivery companies to bother with. My dad is the only employee, and we have a few pickup trucks and a trailer. One day, we get a delivery out to Window Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo reservation, about 2 hours from Farmington. My dad gets a call for the job while he's chilling with his Navajo friend, so he's there with Travis and his girlfriend. Travis mentions how he's got family in Window Rock, and he hasn't seen them in ages and suggests to go with him. It was about 6 or 7 at the time, and it was in the summertime, so my dad decides that we'll go down together. He can do his delivery really quick, then while Travis sees his family, we can go check out the Window Rock, which is a big rock with a large hole in it. It's pretty cool. Now we had to go in separate trucks, because my dad's is weighed down with freight. We decided to bring along some walkie-talkies so we can communicate with one another. We spend our time in Window Rock and everything is generally uneventful, and we start heading home along the old highway with my dad and I in front, and Travis and his girlfriend in the truck behind us. Now I honestly don't remember most of the Window Rock trip, but this next part I can never forget. Now we're somewhere along the highway between Window Rock and Gallup NM. It had just rained earlier in the day, and the rock was kind of slick, so we're taking it slow. On the left of the highway there's nothing but sandstone cliffs, and on the right there's a huge field, separated from the road by a small fence. We crest the top of the hill, and go towards the bottom and see what appears to be a really large dog, sitting back on its own in the middle of the road facing the cliffs. My dad calls over the radio and says, "Hey Trav, do you see that big dog?" Travis starts yelling up and says, "That's not a dog. Speed up now and hit it," almost sounding hysterical. He just keeps screaming, "Hit it, please hit it now." So my dad starts speeding up, and as we get a bit closer, I can begin to see it a bit more clearly. It's covered in this brown wiry matted hair that appears to have blood dried over it. It is still facing the cliffs, but the moment our headlights hit it, it turns and sees us. And it has a face. I don't know how else to describe it other than it's a mix between a bear and a human's face. It looks twisted and distorted, almost in pain. As we get closer to the thing, we start to realise it's actually huge. Though it was sitting on its back legs, it's still massive. We literally get inches from hitting it when it lets out this scream that sounds like somebody's filling up their lungs with water trying desperately to get sounds out. It then leaps towards the field, landing just on our side of the barbed wire fence, then leapt over another, and it's gone. Travis comes on over the radio again saying, "Please keep driving, we have to get out of here, go faster." He kept repeating the last part. We have to get out of there and go quick. Pretty soon we're speeding like crazy, and just as we start to get near somewhere, we get pulled over. Travis pulls his truck over with us, and naturally this makes the cop, a Navajo man himself, very on edge, and he immediately asks why Travis felt the need to pull us over as well. Travis says, "Dude, we just saw a skinwalker a few miles back and it's been following us." The officer turns white and says he's got no problems with us, and just says make sure we keep going. We didn't see anything else that night, but when we got home, Travis refused to let us go without taking home some kind of Navajo totem thing that's supposed to keep it away. So I live in a weird neighborhood, in the oldest house there. A rich guy built this house here as a hunting lodge in the 1800s. Now before it became a little tucked away shrub within the house in bloom post World War II. Maybe it's worth mentioning that my parents brought the home from the last two remaining descendants of aforementioned rich guy, who both promptly died after the sale. Now this neighborhood is known for having weird things happen here, even in the town. I mean, strange lights, ghosts, even cryptic creatures. A lot of occultists exist in the area too. Now, here's what's weird about the neighborhood: the coyotes. There's a giant pack of coyotes in the area. Normally in a wooded area, that's fine, because the coyotes are on steroids, huge muscular things, and they look mangy. They've been known to track and follow hikers, and often people's pets and livestock get mauled or killed by them at night. They're just huge. To someone who isn't local, they think they're wolves. At night, they howl, bark, scream and yelp, starting almost like clockwork at 12. There's rumours that they aren't exactly coyotes, just because of how strange they look and behave. Now I actually spoke to a native friend of mine who said they sound an awful lot like his childhood stories of skinwalkers or wendigos. I did some research, but I didn't know if it could be related really. He told me to remain inside at night and don't investigate sounds. Normally, I've avoided the pack's troublemaking. I have no animals that go outside, as my 4 indoor cats always stay in. The main hangout seems to be the farm or ranch up the street. However, until the other night, now full disclosure, I've been smoking, but not really enough to trip this, but regardless, there was a single coyote in the neighbour's yard across the street. It was barking, howling and yelping at the coyotes, like they do every night, but again, completely alone. It didn't sound right. It sounded like a very good coyote impression, but not good enough to be believed 100%. I suddenly remembered what my native friend had warned me of, and slowly closed and locked my window, shut my blinds and hid underneath my comforter. The howling and yelping abruptly stopped. Now there's some really tense silence for minutes, then it starts whistling. It was some piss poor attempt at calling a bird. At that point, I knew it was exactly what I'd been warned of, but what can I do? Get up and run? Risk making more noise? I'm frozen. Then I heard scuffling across the roof, near my bedroom window, which is right above my head. There was some ragged breathing. Yes, quiet, but it sounds like the wind. Then my ears start to ring, unbearably loudly, enough that it hurt. It became louder, like something's coming closer to me. As the sounds get louder, I become more terrified now. I started to hear scraping against the glass on my window, like somebody with long fingernails is placing their hands on the glass, dragging them across it. All the while, I was still under my blanket holding my breath, trying my damn best to convince myself to stay still. Whatever was out there, please leave me alone. Like my prayers are being answered, suddenly it stopped, and the howling and barking resumed though. As usual, spot near the ranch down the street. God, at dusk the next day, I wafted a lit sage bundle indoors and out, and sprinkled salt at every entry point. Nothing's happened yet, but I'm not safe. I never saw that thing outside the window again, but I'm so scared it's gonna come back. I'm sure it's stalking me now. I just pray it stops. I was driving home from work. I work nights on an Air Force base and stopped by McDonald's to treat myself after my PT test. I had to drive extremely far from my home to find an open McDonald's at 2:15 in the morning. When I finally found one, about 30 minutes from home. After getting my food, I start driving home. The entire way home, I felt an extremely existential dread, like something was off, but about the road I was on. And I felt like I was alone and would never see my wife again. I was on a stretch of highway with trees on both sides and 0 cars passing. After about 10 minutes of driving with no other cars, I saw a spotlight. The light was green, but there was a deer standing under the light. Now it had been raining a hell of a lot, and there's a puddle under the deer, making it appear as though its legs are conjoined in a weird way, and that it's around a foot taller than it should have been. When I drove up to it, I realized it wasn't a reflection, and that's just how it was. I went to drive around it, and as soon as my front bumper got past the deer, my radio suddenly blasted static. I turned the radio off and floored it. When I was around the deer, the radio come on again. Now things get worse. The deer seems to be running right alongside me at stupid speeds. I went 20 over the speed limit on my way home because I had to. Cut through private housing, over speed bumps and whatnot. I had to lose this thing. I got to my driveway, sprinted inside, shut all the curtains and locked the doors. And since then, I've been too scared to even drive at night again, let alone go out on my own. I was 17 at the time. I just got on my first job. I lived in Western Virginia, in a small mountain community. My mum's best friend owned a camping resort not far from my house that had a general store. She said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months in the summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community gets so isolated. Most of us live really far from each other. Now one day, a big burly mountain man come into the store. He's in his early 50s and probably 6'5" and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes are tattered and he wears a long beard. He looked like a woodsy hermit person. He brought some basic items, one of which was a homemade soap bar, when he came to the register. Now he looks at me carefully and says, "Did you make this soap?" "Possibly. Yeah, I do sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" "Yeah, kinda." "I like that a lot," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly didn't know how to reply. I quickly rung up his items and paid with the crumply money that he had. Right before he left, he said, "You cook too." Sometimes. "Bet the boys round here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told my friend's boss about the bizarre encounter and she laughed at it. But then, the mountain man started turning up more often than not. We chatted a little here and there, and as I found out, he had a cabin in the woods. He claimed he built it with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land. Other than the things he brought to the store, over time our chatter escalated, with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me up there making things for him. One time he even said, "Birthing hips that men lust after." God, so creepy. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt, etc. I politely declined, but he got more and more insistent, and I told my boss how weird I felt. The intensity with which he said things really started to scare me. She actually said to me that when he came in, go get her and she would bring things up. "Ah, thanks," I said. I started speaking to him less, and I thought that I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore. But one night, I was closing up, and it's late. Around 10 at night. The other worker left before. I was by myself. The only two cars in the front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed because I knew the mountain man drove one, but I didn't see him in the parking lot, just his car, so maybe, just maybe it's okay. So I quickly walk up to my car and check the back seat before I start her up. But that very moment I turn the ignition, I got nothing but shudders. And my car won't start. It's weird that I had a weird feeling as I was doing so and the car didn't start. Of all nights, why is this happening now? I remembered asking myself angrily, just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help. There's a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I don't wet myself. I don't even want to look, as I know it's him, but I did. And my suspicions are confirmed. He has a huge grin on his face, showing me his teeth which are missing. "I need some help," he said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. My dad's on the way," I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. A smile comes across his face. No he's not. Open the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up straight. Did he know I was bluffing? "No," I said firmly, "leave me alone." Suddenly he's angry. He pulled the handle hard, but I locked the door first. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. "Leave now or I'm calling the cops," I screamed. He doesn't get the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher. I knew she could hear him pounding. She said that they would have an officer out there ASAP, but that could be a while out here. "The cops are here, leave now," I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let anything deter him. But after a moment or few, he stopped. He suddenly walks back to his truck and I watched him go. Hopefully he leaves me. But then, he started walking back towards me with a crowbar in his hand. "No! Get away from me!" I screamed. He started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat of the floor and covered my head for dear life. I hear the sickening crack of the window, and I'm seconds away from death now, but not for long. I heard a male voice shouting, telling him to get away from the car. I see two men approaching, one with a shotgun. I instantly recognize them as people camping nearby. I breathe a sigh of relief and get out of the car, telling them the police are coming. I thank them profusely and wait for the police. Surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make a move. The cops appeared quickly after, so he didn't have much of a chance. They took him away, and I gave my statement. I was pretty shaken up thereafter. After a few weeks, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently, he had a history of mental illness and had been in and out of institutions. He had really been living in an old cabin in the woods where he didn't take meds. My cousin Luke is a cop, and later told me more about the case. The police did a search of the cabin to see if there's anything interesting. Apparently, he kept a journal on me, how he wanted me to be his wife. He mentioned my name a lot, and Luke said there's lots of weird things he didn't want to share with me about what he saw, but tried putting them simply by saying that he had a detailed plan of how to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me into a vulnerable position. When Luke told me that, I burst into tears, thinking just how horribly things could have went that night. Thankfully, he's been put back into a state institution. With any luck, he'll get the help he needs. So, I worked as a camp counselor during my college years. Now, several years before, stories of things like skinwalkers become culturally commonplace. Well, certainly before I'd heard of them. Now, one year, we had a night hike activity with story stations. My station had me by myself on a cliff that overlooks a river, and about halfway through the hike, I was generally the furthest from the other staff at any given time, but because I was in charge of the nature programs, I knew the woods like the back of my hand. I wasn't frightened in the least. Unless there was a recent rain, I could usually get to and from my station without a light. There was another activity where the kids would lead me blindfolded somewhere, and I would lead them back, still blindfolded. I know those woods and those trails. The program staff / storytellers would get a notice to turn off our radios before the first group started the trail. After that, it was dead silence in the dark woods until the first group got there. Since I was far enough, I would usually be 15 to 20 minutes before the first group come in. So one night I'm up there, waiting, at this steep cliff, and I hear about 2 feet behind me, some kind of kid's voice, which sounds like it's about maybe 10 feet away now, saying my name, clear as day. Now it might not seem very strange to hear a kid saying your name at a camp, but think you're alone, and it's important here that we use nicknames for each other for safety reasons, and not a single child would actually know my first name. The staff did, but they were all at least 50 or 60 yards away, and this was very much a child's voice. It was also coming from what should have been mid-air. It scared me so bad that I had to leave my station and get closer to the next one so I could at least talk to her in the darkness. Over the course of the summer, almost all of the program staff had similar experiences during the night hikes, until finally we scrapped the activity because nobody wanted to be there alone without radios again. Now, let me preface this by explaining that I'm not claiming this was any particular phenomenon. I'm telling you exactly what happened as it happened. No exaggeration or lying of any kind onto what happened. Now, 20 years ago, my older brother and I, who was 19 and 15 at the time respectively, were working on a landscaping job in northern Arizona, so we had gotten off work at the site around 7 PM, hopped into the truck and started the 45-minute commute home. On my way back, there is a dirt road that leads about 20 miles into the desert. It's there mainly to take dirt bikes out or go four-wheeling, etc. But we would use it as it's a good spot to stop and just smoke. So we drive for a couple of miles and park in between these two hills that hide the truck and us pretty well. We've done this about 30 times up to that point, but never again. Now we stop and I commence a ritual. He was talking about something, but I wasn't really listening until I heard his voice change saying, "Did you hear that?" We both listen and hear a high-pitched, tiny sound for a split second, then suddenly silence. The desert is actually pretty loud at night. I remembered realizing that the sound is gone suddenly. As we sat there for maybe 5 seconds, my brother gasps and starts the truck and floors it. We go absolutely flying out of there, and I'm asking what happened, but he doesn't say anything. We hit the street, and the lights of a passing car show his face. He's pale and completely wide-eyed and mouth open. I got scared seeing him like this and just wondered what had happened. He finally stopped at a McDonald's parking lot and then we got into town. He starts crying. I pat him on the shoulder and say, "Are you okay?" Then he says, "Remember what, man? We're in the desert for like 5 minutes before you went flying out like a crazy person." He then starts sobbing. He said it had me and he couldn't do anything. He said it took me. At this point I started putting some things together. It was quiet out, no cars. Looked at one of those billboard clocks and saw it was 11:11 PM. My brother told me something had grabbed me through my passenger side window. He had went for his pistol when he suddenly realized he was frozen and couldn't move, and that he knew if he didn't move and get us out of there that we would die right then. He said he felt it in his heart to be true. He then said that he saw this thing which is very tall, thin with huge black eyes. He doesn't remember much else about it, just tall and thin with black eyes that are massive. He sat frozen in absolute terror for hours while the thing disappeared with me into the desert. Then apparently I suddenly appeared in the truck and he gunned it out of there. Over the years I've spoken to him about it twice and he hates the fact I mention it. Now I'm not a forest or park ranger, but I hunt. Now when I say hunt, I don't mean sit down in some tree stand. I mean I'm the guy going out hunting by walking over the entire park with enough on my back to let me sleep at night sort of comfortably, but little enough that I'm not dragging my 150 pounds of yummy out of the woods. Alright, so I'm hunting a fairly large forest somewhere in the northeast corridor of the US. It's not uncommon to run into other people at the edges of the woods. It's fairly uncommon to run into people in the middle of the woods, however, even if it's during the hunting season, unless that is that you're on the trails, which I wasn't. It's decently common to run into ruins of buildings from the 1800s. I happened to be hunting a new valley I was pretty sure had a crossing on it to set the view. I'm basically sitting at the top of a very steep shell, which is actually on the side looking down into a valley with a creek running through it. Approaching this plateau, there's a knife edge that runs up and down the ridge, so it's difficult to get here unless you're extremely determined, drunk or foolish, without actually walking up and down the edge. Getting up here creates quite a lot of noise too from stone sliding on stones, which means that I need to sit up here for an hour to let things settle back down after I made my ascent. It's really difficult, and I left my day pack at the bottom under a pine tree and only had a rifle, binoculars, water and an energy bar. I'm up here for about 3 hours, glassing this little area of a stream, looking for something to cross it, and see nothing but squirrels and the birds, and I finally decide to start glassing the opposite hill out of sheer boredom. I am 90% sure I chose a poor spot and wasted an afternoon looking at nothing. Such is hunting. It's got really interesting days, and it's got really boring days, and this is why it's called hunting and not shooting. Now when I'm screwing around with the binoculars focus, I catch something which almost looks like a person, if they were wearing dark clothes and approximately 4 feet tall. Now 99% of the time, day hikers just pass by without realizing. I'm here even with the blaze orange requirements, or this person must have just pretended they didn't see me, but you'd be amazed how many times somebody has almost walked straight through my strand. Anyway, this person wasn't moving, which makes me start to think that I'm wrong. I'm just standing there, behind the cover of some low scrub brush and tree branches, and I would have missed it if it wasn't for the colour. I zoom out a bit and realise I'm not looking at a person, but it's actually a collapsed cabin. And I was looking at where the door would be, except it really looks like a person, and cabins aren't blue. I move the zoom back onto the door and I play with the focus for about 5 minutes, and I can't get the person to come back. In fact, the cabin door now has some light from the setting sun visible through the holes in the walls and roof. Whatever 4 foot tall thing I was looking at's moved. Teenagers, right? I thought to myself. Then I realised something else. I can still hear birds and squirrels and all the other things in the woods that would typically go quiet when they notice something, which means they haven't realised I'm here, but also that means that they didn't notice whatever was in the cabin door a short while ago. Now I'm doing my very best to stay as quiet as I can. I would have expected everything in the woods to have gone for cover with a teenager crashing through the brush, but the noise almost made the situation worse. There was stuff moving in the brush now. The problem was the stuff was moving around in the brush. I started to think that maybe it's a trick of the light, since the sun is setting, and it was getting to the part of the day when the tree stumps look like this. I knew I would have to move soon and figured I might as well pack it up since I still had to get down off that shell and back to the pine tree where I had planned to throw a tarp and sleep. At this time, I realised it wasn't dark per se, but it was overcast now. Again, the creepy experience isn't that there's something obviously wrong, it's that everything is so completely normal from what I expected where I was alone. About this time, a fog rolled into the valley, with the combination of overcast weather conditions, sunset, and a ground fog coming up in the wet. There was low valley which had signalled it was time to leave. I checked my safety, put the caps on my glass and reached up to take down my orange flag. The moment I grabbed the flag, dread come over me. That's the only way I can describe it. The woods went from animals going home to sleep to full on, you're in a bad situation here. The movement had attracted what I can only describe as 1,000 invisible eyes, which all turned in unison to notice me. Ever wonder what a deer in headlights feels like? This is it. Then I hear children. I heard children laughing. Not teenagers, not adults, not women, but full-on 5-year-olds laughing like they caught a firefly. I had hiked in 5 miles from the previous day through the woods and put down 2 more today. When I woke up to get to this spot, I distinctly heard children laughing during what I can only describe as the creepiest moment of my life, knowing I'm completely unoccupied having standed there for at least 4 hours or so. I'm pretty sure my feet only touched the shell 3 times getting down from the knife edge, and so it made a ton of noise in doing so. At this point I really don't care. I grabbed my pack and flashlight and absolutely full on brocked it to the next hilltop. I killed my light halfway up the hill, then went to the top of the hill where I threw down the tarp and unrolled my foam, and there I sat all night watching the hill I come from. Now deep in the backwoods, in the backcountry of Montana, my mum was basically hiking up a mountain to get a crystal dig site. She got separated from her group near the end of the trail and was the first to reach the top of the mountain. As she stood on the trail, she saw what she described as a 4-foot by 6-foot black piece of silk whipping through the trees, hovering about 8 feet from the ground. She was startled but not afraid, and she sensed that the thing was aware of her presence and was moving as quickly as it could away from her. She said it was like an Ewok moving from Star Wars. This occurred in 2017, and ever since my mum has posted countless places online asking has anybody else ever seen this, and nobody else seems to have. So I'm a park warden. I basically spend most of my shifts alone, working 5:30 to 2:30 AM in the Canadian wilderness. We have around 300 or so campsites, and a handful of beaches and the infrastructure that goes with them, like showers, etc. It just happens that my park is closed for the winter, which are standard in Canada. There can be feet upon feet of snow and blistering cold, so there's no staff in the park from mid-October to early April. Years ago, a man unfortunately decided to end it all by the river on one of the beaches in November, and nobody actually found him until spring melt. This beach is at the farthest northern point of the park and is pretty isolated, but as it has a beach, it requires at least one patrol an evening. I was just down in the showers at that Pacific beach around 7 PM on a very overcast day, so no sun to create shadows. I was checking the supplies in the first aid kit and signing off on fire extinguishers. The weather was blah, so there's no campers out or patrols anywhere near the beach, and the parking lot was empty except for my cruiser. All of a sudden, a feeling of intense panic washed over me, and I booked it to the cruiser. I get in and slam the door, and a few breaths in and wait for the feeling to pass. After a minute or two, I get back to business, but this time I'm doing so in my locked car. Now, by this time, I start filling out blinders and work logs, and suddenly, a huge dark shape moves across my driver's side window, and I scream and jump back. My immediate thought was that somebody had been lurking and was about to try and open the door. Sure enough, I open the door and it's empty, not a soul around. You can bet to God that I left any and all future maintenance tasks in that neck of the park to be done by the day shift. I floored it out of there. Now, maybe it's not the scariest or most shocking story that I've shared, but it really rattled me to the core, and I know I saw something that day, and it still shakes me even now. Now, this story really happened over 20 years ago, back when I was 16. During this time, I lived with my mum and stepdad in a remote area 70 miles west of Las Vegas, Nevada. I had gone out to visit my friends, being allowed to drive over on my own for the first time ever. I had a lovely time watching a movie and getting food together until it was time for me to head home. The curfew I was given was 10 PM, but if I was running late for any reason whatsoever, then I had to phone and call my parents, but I would need to find a payphone to do so. That night, wrapped around me and my 71 Chevy pickup, as there was no street lights or any houses for most of the way home. As I pulled up to the first of two stop signs, I could see an older sedan stopped with its hazards on. I pulled up behind it and waited as a man in his 30s to 40s started walking towards me from the driver's side. Even at this point, I didn't have any alarm bells going off. Being in the middle of the Mojave Desert, providing some assistance or anything to stranded people was pretty common. Now, people rapidly go into severe problems by not having enough water when a vehicle breaks down, and not realizing that it's a desert and people die wandering deliriously away from the highway for help. Anyhow, I rolled down my window, and as he come abreast of my door, I could smell the liquor on him. I could then see another man in the passenger seat, as this was before anybody I knew had cell phones, and the nearest payphone was a good 10 minutes drive ahead, and I didn't have a way to call the cops on a drunk driver immediately. The man explained that his car stalled and said can I help him out. I said to him, is it a stick shift? Which it was, so I said was he familiar with push starting? He said yes. So I agreed to, gently as I could, push the car with my truck while the engine tries to tick over. For anyone that isn't familiar, this is a way to start a manual car that's having battery or starter issues. I knew my truck would be fine, and I didn't feel like it would be wise to get out and try and push the car physically. Pushing the car worked without a hitch, but here's where things started going south. They get out and thank me. They then invite me to hang out and have some fun with them, but I decline. They pull off to the side of the road and I continue on my way. Only then they begin following. So here I am. It's 09:50. I'm running late because I stopped to help them. Admittedly, I hadn't given myself much leeway from leaving my friends to begin with. Then these drunk, creepy older guys started following me on a road without any man-made lights except for car headlights, and I'm at least 10 minutes from a payphone. I start to think to myself, maybe I'm being paranoid, so I turned down a road that I know gave me a couple turn-offs to either head back to town or loop around to the gas station with a payphone. The car follows behind me. I'm thinking, God, so I take another turn that only leads to a couple of houses at the end of the road and they turn behind me. I take another turn to loop back around and head to the station, and they follow again, so at least I know they are following me and not just heading home. At this point, my heart's pounding. I decide to try and lose them. I pull the car to the side of the road and I see them pull up behind me. I wait as the driver gets out of the car and begins walking towards me. His companion also gets out and starts walking towards me. I wait until they almost get to my tailgate and floor it. My wheels dig into the rock and a puff dirt comes up behind me, which is basically a cloud. With the lead way, I'm heading towards a gas station. The gas station is deserted, but the payphone is showering the lights from the gas pumps. I call home and explain what had happened and why I was running late. My stepdad then said speak to the worker there and try and get directions back. And luckily they gave me some directions and I made it home okay that night. Now, I'm not really a park ranger, but an environmental educator at a nature preserve, so I spend a lot of time outdoors, and it's something I've done often in isolated areas. There's one particular area at the park that I try not to take the group of kids anymore. Now once in a while we have to go through that trail since it's a shortcut to the kayak launch, and when it's about 95 degrees out, you're ready for anything to make your trip shorter. When I started there, one of the first things that I did was familiarize myself with all the areas of preserve. So I spent a lot of time hiking through all of the trails, even the rarely used ones, since I have to know my way around to navigate groups or go rescue someone if they get lost, which happens. Now one part of the preserve is an old homestead site of a now abandoned pineapple plantation. It was settled in the 1890s. We don't know much about the family beyond the name and the approximate year they settled there, and the approximate year the homestead was abandoned. Now this is in southern Florida, and there are thousands of similarly abandoned homestead sites. The early settlers of that area had to be tough as nails. This was pre-railroad area, and the nearest town was about 5 miles through what would have been wilderness at the time with no real roads. So these guys are on their own in a land absolutely bursting with mosquitoes, panthers, bears, and bad water. Water table is high and fresh water can easily be contaminated by salt water nearby. In other words, the early homesteaders were Pretty tough because that's the only way they'd survive. There is a narrow trail though that was once a homestead site. Now on one of my first days, I decided to trek through there. I got about half a mile in when I start to get weird vibes. Now I've always been relatively sensitive to my surroundings and kind of have a good touch if something's off really. I guess it's something you just develop in time of being out in the woods and whatnot, or isolated areas, but if something's not right, it probably means that your instincts are picking up on something you should pay attention to. Usually this means your brain is picking up on minute movements on the ground that indicate an unfriendly snake may be nearby, or another animal that you don't want to confront. While the panthers are nearly gone, we've got aggressive wild boars and bobcats that freely roam. So I stopped dead in my tracks and let my mind go quiet, looking around carefully for any warning signs, and there aren't any. And I didn't see any recent tracks, but the bad vibe feeling was still there, and I shrugged it off and kept going. The trail was beginning to get narrower, and the bad vibes kept growing in my gut. I felt I was being watched and followed. Now, this is an isolated area, so the possibility that a person was following me is remote, but possible. I stopped every few meters, but there was no sounds. Actually, none at all, not even birds. I start to sweat and my heart starts to race. One thought that kept echoing in my mind: you are not welcome here. Turn around and go. Well, I thought, just getting jittery from my nerves. I thought I might come to a bend and the trail could stop. Now this is almost what happened when I felt this. My feet would go no further. In my mind, the phrase got louder and louder that I'm not welcome here. I then hear a crash behind me, but when I turn to investigate, there's no one there. No animal, human, nothing. The vegetation was sparse enough that I would have been able to see something, so I turned around and left. I put it down to nerves or me being a wimp or something and sort of forgot about it. About a month later, I'm taking a campground through the kayak launch where our kayaks are. I decided to take the kids through the narrow trail to save us about 10 minutes. We get to the same bend of trail and the kids have gone silent. These are 9-year-olds in summer camp. They are not silent, they're never silent. I look behind me to one kid who looks as though he's scared, terrified. I don't like it here. Why not? He looked at me and said, we shouldn't be here. Now I couldn't turn around at this point, so we hustled to the kayak launch and all was well, but we're a little on edge. I took another group through the trail a week later, and again, the kids are silent at that bend in the trail. For that whole summer, whoever I took to the shortcut would go silent and get the bad vibes. Now, I try not to go down that stretch of trail anymore if I can help it. Obviously, this is nothing more than a gut feeling, but it's not a lonely one. It's shared by many others who have no idea about things here. Now, I don't know if it's the spirit of whatever homestead was there, but it's hard to describe and there's definitely something wrong there. I really can't explain this. I only worked as a park ranger for 1 year, but I had an experience I'd like to share. I was on patrol one day, just doing my usual business, not too far away from the ranger station. I'd only been doing the job for about 3 months, so really not too long, and everything was completely normal. Now, usually weird things can happen to me, but never really anything that I couldn't explain. So I felt fairly confident during this time. I had a couple of weird things to deal with, like people that thought they were missing and stuff, but it was basically just hikers that had got lost and I had no issue helping them back. One of the big dangers while you're in a park like this one, a national park, is you can get dehydrated very easily and not really realise it. So it's important that you always have water, and I always had water with me. The only annoying thing that ever really happened was I managed to burst my camel pack and it leaked all down my back. At the time I was terrified because I thought I was bleeding, but this was a different story and not what happened on one particular day. So I'm on my patrol like normal, and I feel fairly confident. I haven't done the job for too long, but I seem to be picking up lots of different things, and all of the other rangers at work here are very helpful and friendly. Now I have to patrol a certain area, and I get to the first checkpoint. When I get to the checkpoint, I can hear music playing. It sounds very faint, but I check my phone quickly, to which makes me realise that there's nothing playing from my phone. I quickly feel around in my other pockets thinking maybe I've got someone else's phone by mistake, but there's nothing. I then throw the pack on the ground and I realise it's not coming from me, so that raises the next question: where is it coming from? I remain still for a moment and I can hear an old music box being played. Now it's really weird. It sounds relatively powerful but kind of far away, but I really can't tell the direction. This is really bizarre, and like nothing I've ever experienced before. I managed to convince myself that maybe somebody had left one out here, and I should try and find it. I managed to eventually coordinate roughly where the sound should be coming from, and it's in the direction I need to go regardless, so I head off. While I'm walking, I realise that something just feels different now. Not like I'm in danger, but almost like I am out of my body, if that makes sense, like I've gone into autopilot. I walk for a good 5 minutes and realise that the sound hasn't stopped. It's really strange. I look up and I can see some kind of strange white light just coming through the tree line up where I think the sound is coming from. It's weird because it kind of looks like sunlight, but too bright and white to be that. And it's actually hurting my eyes. Now it's strange because this seems to move off, completely unnatural to sunlight or other things that should be here. And I knew it was real because it was so bright that it kind of left the trail in my vision as like a green colour. You know, if you ever catch a reflection or laser in your eye, it kind of burns for a few seconds, just like that. So I was certain something was there. So I continue after whatever this was. Now the sound continues and continues, and I don't ever seem to get closer to it. I literally took off half my clothes at one point just to check there wasn't anything on me, because that would be absolutely hilarious if it was on me, but there wasn't anything. And the sound seems to vanish and all is normal. So, I ended up finishing my shift for the rest of the day and heading into the cabins where I was actually sleeping. Now I managed to forget about what I heard that day. However, halfway through the night, I hear that same sound again. Convinced I was dreaming, I rub my eyes, and then the adrenaline hits me and wakes me up. That wasn't coming from my head. There was the sound again. I quickly get up and run to the window, just in time to see some kind of light just off in the porch. It's really bizarre. Nothing should be around now, and we don't have any lights on where we're sleeping. Thinking maybe it's one of the other rangers, I quickly go over to the radio and wake up my buddy in the next one over. I say, "Did you see that?" My buddy's very confused, and from the tone of his voice I can tell that he's just woken up, and I say, "Give me 1 minute," and I go outside. As I go outside, I can't believe what I see. There's a very small, ancient looking music box just sitting on the porch, still playing its song, just like before. Now, confused out of my mind, and probably just being relatively delirious from waking up, I go off to investigate what the light is, which I know is very stupid. I look around and I can't seem to find anything. And then, I can see it again, just illuminating some of the trees, moving at a slow pace, and I follow after it. Now when I sprint after this thing, it doesn't pick up pace, it just seems to be at the exact same speed and distance to me. It's really hard to explain, but it's weird. I thought maybe it was some kind of hiker out of their mind that was playing tricks on me, but every time I seem to get closer to this thing, it just kind of vanishes through the trees, and what's really bizarre is the way it moves. It doesn't make sense how it kind of drifts through the trees. Now my common sense kicks in. The next thing I realise is that I have to turn around and immediately start sprinting in the opposite direction. After about a good 4.5 minutes of running, I make it back and my other ranger friend is there with a coffee. He says, "What were you doing?" I explain what happened and he looks at me very confused. I then point off in the distance and he goes very pale. I say what's wrong and he says, "Do you see that light?" I say, "Yeah, I just chased it." He said, "I've seen this before," and he quickly goes inside and tells me to follow. He slams the door behind and turns on all the lights in his cabin. He then tells me that he's seen this light before, and he says to me, "Did you hear the music?" At this point, the penny dropped and I feel very scared. I say, "Yeah, I did, that's why I investigated. I thought you put the music box out there." He then looks at me and says, "No, of course I didn't, I was asleep." And now the fear takes over. He then tells me that he's seen the exact same thing 2 or 3 times before over the last 6 months and he still has no idea what it was. We then realise that the music box should still be outside, and we quickly open the door and head out again to investigate. We look to the exact spot where it was before, and it's not there. I say, no, this can't be possible, it was literally right there on the porch." And my friend looks at me and says, "Don't worry." I start frantically looking around and I can't find it anywhere, and my friend can't either. We ended up staying up for another 2 hours just trying to find this box thing, but we can't find it, and there's no more music. We both looked off into the woods and we can't see any more light now. We decided that we should just stay in one person's cabin for safety reasons, and we start sharing ideas of what this thing could have been. I'd hate to admit it, but I kind of think it was some kind of alien, I tell my friend, and he's leaning more towards the fact it could be something more normal, but it doesn't make sense. There's no reason that it should have been so bright, or bright enough to have hurt my eyes, but why would it have been playing the music box? It doesn't really make sense. Neither of us can account for where that music box gone, and we decided it couldn't have possibly been anybody else because we're the only guys out here, and of course we would have seen or heard them, but how could anybody be this far out? How would they have possibly known their way around the tall trees, and how could they have moved so quickly without disturbing any of the ground? That's the weirdest part for me. I don't know whether somebody or a group of people followed me out there and they had some kind of really bright lantern or something, but it just doesn't make sense to me. The entire situation was just off, and that night is actually what made me change careers. Mind you, I couldn't do it as quick as I wanted. I still had about another 10 months left in the tank before I was able to actually leave, but I requested to leave that area and thankfully it was granted. I never did go back to those cabins, and I never really spoke to that friend much afterwards, so I don't know what else happened. One thing I do know is that there's something out there in those woods that shouldn't be there, and for as long as I live, I'm never gonna forget that song and that light that burnt my eyes. About 8 PM last night, I was walking with a friend of mine, Sally, about a mile to the closest cafe. We're both girls in our late 20s, neither of us drive. Sally didn't have her Opal card, which is the Australian version of an Oyster card. So walking, that's our only option. It's summer over here, so it was fairly well lit, and we're both walking down the main roads and not too concerned, when we finally arrive at this cafe and sit down. Now I was paying with my credit card, And sure enough, it was cash only. Sally was on the phone when I got back from the counter, so I just gestured her to stay put and guard while I went to get the cash out. This is my home suburb, so I know there's ATMs around, and my best bet is a gas station about a block away. Now I'm doing a light jog so I don't keep Sally waiting, when a balding sweaty guy, probably in his late 40s with a tank top and no shoes, comes pacing behind me as I pass the corner of the block. He walked for about 100 meters. I really don't think much of it. The gas station was the next building along, and it seemed like he'd just come out of a nice suburban house along the street, and it's not the witching hour, so I just assume he's going to the gas station as I am. He didn't even cross my mind as I entered this tiny convenience store, nor did he follow me in. In my peripheral vision, I saw him walk past the door and out of sight. I look around for an ATM that they have inside sometimes. No luck. So I go up to this man in his late 30s, at the desk, reluctantly asking if they do a cash out. He smiles and says of course, saying who's with you. I have no idea who he's talking about at first, but he then points to the man from earlier, pacing around outside the store. Keep in mind, he didn't look at all menacing. He wasn't going back and forth just outside the door. He was just drifting in space outside, from the pavement to the gas pumps to the storefront, seemingly aimlessly. Maybe he's on drugs. I tell the clerk no, not thinking much of it, and he says, he was staring at you before, and I thought maybe he's your father. I laugh it off. I wasn't concerned at all. He was still ambling around outside. I couldn't imagine him having a fixed gaze on anything. I thank the clerk for the cash, but before I turn away he says, just wait and see if he leaves. We wait for a few minutes in silence, and the guy begins to pace back and forth directly against the front wall of the store, looking straight ahead, but never in. It still looked like the man was just a drug addict, and seemed harmless. Not once did I catch his gaze, so I figure it's safe to slip out, where it's starting to become dusk and kind of bright. Sally was texting me, where are you? I thank the guy at the desk again for his concern, assure him that I don't know the guy and am not involved in some weird scheme to rob the store. The clerk asks if I want him to walk out with me. I say that it should be alright, and begin walking away from the block. As I leave the store though, the drifting man stops pacing and makes a beeline for me from the other end of the building. I seriously don't think much of the guy at all up until this point, but now he's powering towards me. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I start to power walk so he doesn't think I'm actively trying to escape him, still trying to convince myself that I'm being paranoid and should be more casual. I don't look behind me to see how close he is. I reach the pavement on the other side of the gas pumps when I hear the clerk outside. He's yelling at me, run! I make a break for it, looking over my shoulder. He grabbed the man from behind. The balding man isn't even glancing behind him or trying to escape. He's literally just staring at me, running away with this death stare. I kept running until I crossed the road and then turned around, but still standing. The clerk is holding on to the man. The clerk and I are just looking at each other in pure bewilderment, not really knowing what to do. He makes a hand gesture to go and I wave thanks. I go back to Sally and we rush home a complete different way. It's a really weird experience. I'm just thankful that The gas station worker was so kind and caring. When I was younger, I worked at a gas station as an attendant. I was really hoping to do a good job to impress my supervisors, but I had a few things go wrong what made him lose faith in me. One of the scariest moments was a crazy local drove down by the station, hid in the bushes, and literally started shooting the pumps. My boss is convinced he's aiming for me, but it seemed like I was an unintended target, that he was actually trying to shoot the supplies. Paint cans and oil cans suffer the most damage. I can't figure out why on earth he was trying to do this. He is a real nutcase. I was lucky that the whole thing didn't blow up that day. Freaking crazy. This happened about 6 months ago, and it's really been bugging me since. This will be long, but I must set the scene. So my family has a cabin we've had since the 60s, and I've been going there my entire life throughout the years. It's nestled in a little town of less than 2,000, surrounded in vast forest and farmland. You see cows everywhere and stray dogs that let you stroke them. You'll maybe see 30 people in a day if you go into the little town and shops around. Definition of a small country town for sure. Since I spent my entire life there, I know pretty much everyone. All my family knows everyone. Men dressed in western clothes with big jeans and old flannel shirts and belts with big buckles. Women dressed in jeans and tank tops with country factory logos on them. They're all nice enough and keep to themselves. So I'm driving up there one night to meet my parents since they had been gone the night previously to open the cabin for spring. My boyfriend has also flown in so he can finally meet my family up there. I'd been driving until it got dark. About a 2-hour and 10-minute drive from my house, and he had been taken over driving from around 10. There's a little national park close by, about 15 miles of total land. Since I'd fallen asleep and couldn't give directions, he decided to log the address into the GPS. It took him through the back way through the park that I never drive through. So when he woke me up to ask me where the next turn is since the GPS said he couldn't go either way, it took me a minute to figure out where the hell are we. There were no lights anywhere, and we're the only car for about 15 miles. There's long forest with tall giant trees on either side of the road, with a lonely deer or two in the woods to keep us company. I mentioned switching drivers because I remembered that road, which would lead directly into the intersection that would go through a small community up to the mountain by my cabin. But it was prime. Leave a tow baby on the side of the road and kidnap someone when they check it out territory. It was dark enough that the forest was thick enough that we joked some cult members are probably there. Hell, maybe they are. Needless to say, we decided stopping isn't a good idea. We eventually passed through a small clearing / intersection with a dinky concrete building on the side of the road with one light on, and a car pulled in the slanted gravel ground. My boyfriend drives forward. He then sees that there's 2 people there. My gut immediately twisted, and I start to feel sick. Sick enough to feel ice cold sweat running through my hair, and my veins now are pumping through to my stomach. You never see people at night here, and it's 2 teen boys in fact, wearing nice clothes, Nike shorts and obnoxiously coloured sport workout clothing, aka very out of place, like something's wrong. They see us coming and walk away. From what appears to be an old beat-up car, probably from the 1960s, and it's important to note that this was completely gone of any paint and rusting. They smile at us and wave. I don't have a clue who these people are, and I'm starting to hear noises around us. I knew a gas station was right up the road from us. They could have just walked from there, but there's no lights up the road and no reason to be here. The building around us is abandoned, but there's a light on the wall. I'm starting to think these are in on it. They walk out onto the road, almost blocking my boyfriend from going forward, who had to slow down continuously not to hit them. Suddenly the light goes out in the building. They constantly wave their arms and smile at us, saying something that we can't hear. We think about stopping but decide it's stupid to. My boyfriend quickly drove around them, slamming on the gas, trying to calm me down since the whole scene scares the life out of me. Images of getting out of the car and something stranger or worse happening flew through my head. I look behind us and they're suddenly angry, staring at us, not moving an inch, and the light flickers on in the background in the building. Who are those kids? Why were they wearing city clothes? They looked too young to be driving. I know it wasn't their car. And who was in the building? We finally made it out and found the intersection we wanted that led to the familiar gas station, and he didn't hesitate when I said I need to drive next. About 10 or so minutes later we get to the cabin and explain what happened, and my parents are terrified. God knows what would have happened if we had stopped and actually got out. I don't like to think of it. A little over a year ago, I worked at a gas station. It's one of those 24/7 ones with a mini mart inside of it, and I worked the evening shift. Now, I saw and dealt with a lot of messed up things in that store, which just led me to roll my eyes when people were doing or saying creepy stuff. Hell, if I had $1 for every time I was threatened with death, I'd be retired now. So one night, I was out in the store restocking shelves when one of the regulars came in and started talking to me. He was a full-blown druggie. He would have been in his 50s, and he was tweaking while sitting on me. By this point, I'm used to weird stuff and ignore it. He said some messed up things to me though, something about what he wanted to do with me. I zoned in and out of what he was saying. It wasn't uncommon for him to ramble about weird acts and other gross things. I tell him that I have to get back behind the counter because my co-worker needs me to make coffee for a customer. He was a bit irritated but said that he would talk to me later and left the shop. After making coffee, I had to restock drinks, but the day team hadn't emptied the trolleys of boxes, so I took out the boxes to the big bin. The bin is located on another side of the store, but there's no cameras, so people inside the store can't see you there. That used to make me nervous, but I had been there longer than some of the people who had come through, and was used to the environment. As I was throwing the boxes in the bin, the tweaking guy from before comes up to me, grabs my arm. I tried to play it off like he's goofing around and laugh and say something like, "Hey, I know you like me, but you can't do that. My husband's gonna get mad." Sounds like I wasn't trying much, but with people like him, it was best to remain friendly. The last time someone was more firm, he got knocked out by a right hook, and I was a lucky girl who got to witness it and call the police. He then gets angry and says, "I told you I was gonna have my way with you." Now, I've stopped smiling and I'm scared. He shoves me against a bin and goes to unbuckle his belt when glass smashed. One of my favourite customers was across the road at a pub and saw him go straight for me, knowing his reputation, knowing something bad was happening. And when he saw what was going on, he smashes a bottle over his head. Cops were called and I don't see him again. As for the guy who saved me, I'd given him free coffee for a month. I refused outright to take out the boxes now. I'm just glad I got off okay and was saved that day. Probably the weirdest thing that happened to me in my life was when I was driving to a gas station one night. Now, I was on a very long road trip at the time, heading from college to home. I literally had to drive hundreds of miles, and I'm in the middle of the backwoods, not seeing cars or buildings for miles. I'm starting to get worried because of how low my gas is running. I'm really thinking that I'm gonna have to tent it out here in the middle of the night or something, the last thing that I want to be doing. And hey, did I forget to mention that I'm terrified of the woods? Just as I'm thinking this, I decide to switch on the radio to try and calm my nerves. Even worse, they're playing ABBA songs. I really don't like ABBA songs, and I continue going. Luckily for me though, I've got the moonlight to help guide me, even though that my headlights aren't doing much to penetrate the woods. We now are entering the dangerously low gas territory, and I'm worried. But lo and behold, what do I see? An old gas station up ahead. Ah, thank God, I think to myself. I was getting worried there. I pull into the gas station and stop for a second before getting out. I have a really weird feeling. I know it's quiet where I'm driving, but it's just far too quiet up here. I look around and don't see anyone. There's no one near the counter either, and it looks abandoned almost. I then hear a voice on the intercom. "Yeah, just go pump your gas, we'll help you in a minute," in a horrible raspy old voice. Now, the very second that I go to unlock my door, all of the lights shut off. I know it's not a power outage either, but I can still hear the sounds of the intercom not being turned off fully. Needless to say, I turn my engine key. I'm shaking so much I can't even put it into gear. Not to worry, adrenaline takes over, and I speed up to 60 like I've never drove so quick in my life, and don't bother looking back. As I've been driving for about half a minute, I can see lights in the distance behind me. I'm scared to look. Turns out, all of the lights are on again in the gas station. I have no idea what happened that day, or what they were planning to do with me. Things I do know for a fact though is that they purposely turned off the lights and were purposely waiting for someone to come there. And I also know that there was no help or way to find me if anything happened out there.